Hey everybody, Marcus here. I'm here once again with Dr. Gregory Sadler. Though this is the fourth interview with Dr. Sadler on this channel, I'll give a quick introduction to those who may not have seen any of the previous interviews. So, Dr. Sadler is an academic philosopher who has been quite active for the better part of a decade in disseminating philosophical thought to the mainstream. He operates a consultancy called Reason.io, which has lectured and continues to lecture at, at this point countless events. He offers philosophical counseling, structured courses, as well as one-on-one tutoring. He also runs, well, quite a popular YouTube channel, which is where I had originally discovered his work. In our previous interviews, Dr. Sadler and I discussed anger, friendship, and most recently, the virtue justice as it pertains to the law. Today, we'll be discussing virtus, the Roman virtue from which we derive our English word virtue, as well as our concept of manliness. I'll be posting links to Dr. Sadler's various initiatives in the description, so check them out and make sure to subscribe to his YouTube channel. But for now, I suppose we should get started. Dr. Sadler, before we head straight into the topic, are there any new shenanigans you have been involving yourself in since we last spoke 4 months ago?
Well, yeah, there's quite a few. Some of them are continuing lecture series and that sort of thing. But the biggest thing was October was Stoicon in New York and Stoic Week. So I spoke at Stoicon about anger and Stoicism, and got to meet a lot of cool people very interested in contemporary applications of Stoicism. And then, we went through Stoic Week itself, which is a kind of a big international thing. We had some events, and I opened up a free Epictetus class on Epictetus's Enchiridion at the very end of Stoic Week. And I think we now have about 260 people enrolled in that. So that's kept me pretty busy.
Well, that sounds great. So you've been definitely keeping busy since we last spoke. In terms of your Epictetus course, is that still ongoing?
Yeah, it's a sort of learn at your own pace course. So some people got into it, and the real go-getters, I think, worked through it in about a week. There's videos associated with it. I go through every chapter of the Enchiridion line by line. So there's about 21 half-hour videos. And I think that, you can only watch them so fast, right? But then there's quizzes and handouts and discussion forums and things along those lines. So some people are still working their way through the course. Other people are joining the course. I get about 2 or 3 new people each day. It'll be interesting to see how long it takes to get to MOOC size. I'm not quite sure what qualifies, maybe 1,000. But there's quite a few people already enrolled. And so if you want to go into a deep dive in this classic Stoic text, that's probably a good course for that. If you just want an introduction to Stoicism, there's actually a great course by Massimo Pigliucci. I think it's called Stoicism, the Very Basics, that's available. And I'll give you the link to that as well.
Cool. That sounds fantastic. Yeah. So anybody listening, there'll be a link in the description helping you find, I guess, these resources. But I suppose we should then dive right into Virtus itself. So the basic introduction I can give about it is that we're focusing on a period of history kind of around 400 to about BC to about 400 AD, around the time of the Roman Empire, and the kind of rise of this concept. So, Dr. Sadler, what's your take on Virtus?
Well, so that's a big question. What we see in that time period, which is, sort of the rise of Greek philosophy and political theory, and then it spread throughout the Mediterranean because of Alexander's conquests and some of the other Greek colonizations. And then, that's one end. The other end is sort of the final triumph of Christianity within the Roman Empire that's faltering, but is going to continue on in a lot of its structures, for another 1,000 years or so. Virtue ends up meaning a lot of different things to different people. You can identify a common core to it, I think, which is we call a virtue something that's identified as a good trait of character. So something that's not just a temporary flash in the pan experience, like somebody being brave on one occasion, but something that you can say that person has. But then once you get to that point, there's a lot of dispute. Well, what are the virtues? How should we identify them? How do you build them? Who actually has them? Who doesn't? And so, like, Aristotle observed there's a lot of people who use the words, but they may not have a clear conception, although they have some conception of what say great souledness or courage or justice mean. And so it's a really important term because it gives us ideals that we can point ourselves towards, but it's not something that means exactly the same things, or like a cookie cutter. You have a virtue cookie cutter. Here's justice. Here's temperance, and we just plop them out. It's individuated, and it has to do with how we live in relation with other people for the most part. There are some virtues you can practice on your own. Most of them you practice in relation to other people, I would say.
And if we use just the word virtus as just being a translation to our English word virtue, yeah, we could definitely explore that subject. However, the Romans specifically used it in a contextually specific way, where virtus was more of an amalgamation of other virtues, not necessarily all of the classical virtues of temperance, fortitude, justice, and phronesis, but it also had other things that it talked about, and it specifically referred to when it was associated with the public sphere and men.
Yeah, and it comes from the word for man, vir. So sometimes it's appropriate to translate it as manliness, and it has something of that connotation later on in people like, say, Machiavelli. So we're talking like 1,000 years later from the period that you're describing, but he's hearkening back to that period, and so it would encompass certain of the virtues, like courage, for example, plays an important role. It's interesting because etymologically, so this is a bit of a digression, right? Virtus is coming from vir, man. In Greek, it's arete, excellence, but it's the word for courage that's actually coming from the word for man, Andrea, coming from aner. So there's kind of interesting slippages there. But yeah, you're right. There's this notion. I would say that part of what we could associate with it would be the notion of being able to handle one's own affairs properly, which is really a matter of prudence or practical wisdom. Justice would play a role in it, but it's not just behaving in a just way. It's also having the capacity to impose justice on other people, those that one is in charge of, but also those who are, say, one's rivals. And so we can talk about virtue in this manliness way as, a synthesis of different character traits oriented towards agency, oriented towards getting things done. Not just getting things done in any old way, but getting things done in a way that's good, but also admirable,
Yeah, and from what I've put together about exploring this topic, is it was not something you age into. It was something you had to earn and pursue, and and there were people would distinguish each other, almost like calling you unmanly or telling you to man up, or be synonymous with a statement to encourage you to pursue virtus in that following fashion. It was also considered very much a quality necessary for an emperor.
Yeah, and not all of them displayed that, unfortunately. There's quite a, and there's some emperors who seem to start out good. There's a lot of hope in them, and then things go to pot. And usually, here we're getting into sort of basic psychological motivations, and these are things that philosophy was exploring too before the Roman Empire. Think about Plato's famous Ring of Gyges thought experiment. If you had absolute power and nobody could could really interfere with you, although a lot of the Roman emperors, you could still stab them or things like that. But you had that sort of absolute power to put anybody to death who you wanted to. How would you behave? And those who have virtus would be able to exercise some self-control, but not self-control in a way of just shrinking back from everything, but recognizing that by retaining self-mastery, they can do more. End up coming because they're self-indulgent with respect to bodily pleasures, which it's a lot easier to do, and you can sleep with whoever you want or enjoy whatever foods you want. Some of their control, or their own fears. I think there's quite a bit of paranoia, some of it quite legitimate. Those things proceeded on the part of some of the emperors. And, so if we think about who are the emperors that we particularly associate virtus with, Augustus, maybe Aurelius too. He was one of the 5 good emperors towards the end of things.
Oh, but you would have to say with Marcus Aurelius at least that he kind of made a mistake because all the emperors of the Golden Age were elected, and his son inherited the title after the fact. So that decision probably wasn't the best.
Yeah, well, it wasn't the only mistake that he made, even by his own. And when you read the Meditations, you see him being very scrupulously honest with himself. I mean, they weren't intended for publication, so there's that, right? It's maybe a little bit easier to be honest, but he took himself to task. And that was part of this. That was part of Stoic practice, was doing a daily examination of how well you were doing. So he also managed. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say, so there definitely is a connection with, I guess, the Roman implementation of virtus and Stoicism and Stoic thought in general.
Yeah, although I think you could look at it in terms of almost like Venn diagram circles. There were overlaps rather than a complete coincidence. So Stoicism was attractive to people, say, in the military, for example, as it is still today. Interestingly, the U.S. Army has engaged in some things of trying to apply Stoicism, and courses discussing Stoicism get taught at places like West Point. But it was attractive in part because it, if we're not looking at the technical philosophy, but we're looking at a more practical, lived way. Taught you how to deal with hardship, how not to let things get to you. Roman soldiering was very much based on discipline and each person doing their thing rather than just being, brave and jumping into the fray. That's how they beat the barbarians back so many times. Seneca actually writes about this. He talks about the barbarians coming in, and they're often better fighters man to man, but they don't get a chance to go man to man because the Romans, got their shields and they're jabbing these guys, and they would also, have to, this from military history, they would have to march an incredible distance daily. With lots of stuff on their back, then set up camp, and it wasn't just like putting up pup tents like it was for us in the army and digging a few foxholes. It was like erecting an entire armed camp, and they would do that daily. So Stoicism, I think, gave a rational, lived way of doing that. And then it was also attractive to quite a few people in we could call them the opinion formers or power exercising parts of society. One of the great heroes for the Stoics who fought in the Civil War was Cato, who fought against Cicero on the side of Pompey. And he leads his men through a lot of pretty terrible experiences. And he does so motivated, precisely by his Stoic philosophy. Cicero, who we don't usually associate too much with military affairs, but who was involved as well, but took a lot of important stances in terms of management of power and legal affairs. He was a great orator, also heavily influenced by Stoicism, although he's not a Stoic himself. So yeah, it played an important role, I would say. Go ahead.
Yeah, the consuls would usually, well, I mean, not usually, but in many instances, the consul would also go to war in times of war. You had
Yeah.
an interesting kind of link up between the military and I think politics in general, in that even if you were a citizen, you still had to serve, I think, a decade in the army, even to be able to go for public office of any sort.
Well, it varied, and serving didn't necessarily mean being out there on campaign. Um, and in some cases, you might, because of your class, be just part of the military, sort of like being in the reserves. If there was a war, you needed to go out and fight. Over time, that ends up getting displaced, and towards the end of the period that you're talking about, the Romans were relying very heavily on mercenary troops that were incorporated into the Roman army. A lot of them barbarians, being hired. Although I suppose some of them would have been, subjects at that time. If the Gauls had been conquered for a while, they'd enroll. Yeah.
But
So
nonetheless, there was always I guess, an external connection, because the subject again is still this manliness, at least that interpretation of Vitus. Then there was always an association of public displays of this quality to it. It wasn't
yeah.
something you ever concealed or did in secret.
Oh, yeah. That's true. Although I don't suppose there was an awful lot of room for secrecy in those things. What I'm reminded of, and I'm sort of looking around my library to see if I actually have it up here. There's a book called the Deeds of Famous Men, and it's these old stories that are just kind of handed down. They're very early Latin literature. And they're about Romulus and Remus, of course, but also all these people who probably historically existed, and mostly having to do with wars or political machinations, either involved with the kings before they kicked them out, or the early republic, and all these different enemies like the Sabines and the Umbrians and these people were looked at as, centuries later, as examples. Cicero talks about this, for example. He says, when it comes to thinking about virtue, and for example, Stoicism or Aristotelianism, we don't want to have this unrealistic picture of what it means to be virtuous that only a few people could ever possibly meet, and we'll never meet any of them in our life. We want a conception of virtue that's closer at hand to us, that we can identify with, that we can say, yeah, that person over there has it, or that person who died 200 years ago, but whose statue is right here in front of me, he had it. Because otherwise it becomes a less effective concept. It becomes something that can't permeate our day-to-day life. And so I think the virtus that you're talking about fits in with that quite a bit.
Yeah, and the area, I mean, you could talk about the Scipios and defeat of Hannibal and things like that, and those are the sort of people you'd be referencing there. But
Yeah.
but what I'm getting at here mostly is that today, when we think of manliness, we see certain shaming tactics applied, saying, you need to take care of your kids to be a man, and you're a good husband only then you're a man. And there's these things associated to the private sphere, things associated with family, things that would never in Roman times carry with it that sort of title of manliness. That your relationships, you were expected to behave, I guess, somewhat civilly, but that wasn't really where you got the status. That's not really what earned you that title or that glory or the ability to call yourself a man in that way. It was mostly a public affair, in the sense you had to engage either in military works or politics or something in the public sphere.
I suppose. I mean, how you would engage, how you would relate to your children would have some import. I mean, if you were letting them just do whatever they wanted, that would be a problem. If you were horribly cruel to them, that would be seen as, crudelitas, cruelty, rather than manliness. I think you're right. Marriage didn't play an awful lot of role. It cemented alliances, but there women are basically being used as sort of bargaining chips, the way they were in ancient Greece as well, quite a bit. The notion of needing to provide for one's household, though, and this is what child support, I suppose, could be tangentially connected to, although of course usually it's the guy is on his own in an apartment somewhere, and he's paying for kids living with the ex, or if they weren't married, the biological mother. But that notion of supporting, I suppose, yeah, there's a fundamental difference there. It's estranged from the family relationship in the present. Not that mind you, I'm not saying people shouldn't pay their child support. I think it's very important that they do. And I don't like deadbeat dads. I made a lot of effort to not be that myself, but
well, that's a subject all of it itself, whether you're a deadbeat, if something's imposed upon you against your will. And the second thing is, well, there's a number of things we could talk about. Like I have a number of friends, just as a divergence to this, that have looked at what they've had anticipated what the consequence in child support would be for the from a divorce proceeding, and have basically said, if I do the math on all this, not only is it not worth for me to divorce, but I might as well flee the country. And and so they don't
yeah,
even wait out. They don't even wait out the procedure. I'm not saying they'll stay in the marriage. They've already exited the marriage, but they don't even bother with the courts. They just leave.
and remain married.
Well, I mean, no, the wife is, imagine this way. Imagine your marriage has already collapsed, and you're
Yeah,
looking now about what are the possible outcomes of this situation. One of them is you can continue to fight in court and work through the divorce. Another option is what these men have done is look at every possible outcome, even the most positive in their benefit, and those outcomes appear so detrimental, it's not even worth bothering engaging in the process because it's all a waste of time. So the only solution for them is literally just to flee, because
yeah.
that's in their best interest on every front. Leave everything behind and flee. But again, that's another story that could be involved in.
Yeah, I suppose it depends, and we'll talk about, maybe we'll do a thing specifically on that down the line. But I mean, for myself, I'm in a very different situation because I want the best for my kids. I would love to have more time with them if distance wasn't a factor. It certainly would be, and I look at it as sort of a necessary evil that unfortunately money has to pass through the hands of my ex, who isn't particularly well motivated or trustworthy when it comes to that sort of stuff. Hence the divorce. But I think I'm in a very different situation than, say, somebody who finds out that his the woman that he's been seeing got herself. He thought she was on birth control. She wasn't. She got pregnant, and now she, says, "Hey, I want some money." There's a
Well,
wide range of differences, I think.
it's a good way of exploring the subject of the family in general. But let's talk about the Roman family a little bit and see how these sort of situations play themselves out there.
Yeah, and there we've got a considerable range too, because you could think about we were talking a little bit before about the nuclear family, and there were things sort of like that, although there'd be a lot more connection with the extended family than we have, because we're so scattered for the most part, in part because we have transportation, and because of the industrial economy. So you might have a little house. Imagine like a hut, right? And you've got or an apartment set of rooms. You might have father, mother, children running around, and that's more or less it. Although, his dad and mom and her dad and mom are probably just down the street. So you've got that, and then it goes all the way up to these gigantic families. And when we talk about family in that case, there's a paterfamilias, the father of the family, and of course the wife, who often runs the household. And then there's an entire set of other people living with them, who we would nowadays call dependents. At that time, they were called clients. And this is in addition to the servants that they would have as part of the household. But the clients were people who were in some way dependent upon the wealth, the connections, the power, the protection that they could offer of that family. So it's something more like a clan in many respects. And we see structures like this as well, when people think about Abraham in much earlier biblical times. Abraham was essentially the leader of a clan. He had at one time hundreds of other, households associated with him. So when he picks up and leaves, they all go with him. And it was the same thing for the Romans. You might not be the paterfamilias, but you're part of the familia, and you would, in a certain way, participate in the fortunes of that. So, if a family ran into political rivalries and ended up being exiled, that would be a catastrophe, not only for, mom, dad, the kids, or something like that, but for potentially hundreds of other people. And then,
the family.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say that I think one thing important to call out here of what we're describing is that there's a difference between a household and a familia in this context. Like a household could be this atomized nuclear family of the 1950s you're imagining, but a familia is more of a whole large grouping of many households, and again, coming under the authority of one paterfamilia.
Yeah, and so that's a good point. I mean, things along those lines can be worked out in different ways with respect to power. The Romans, it was centralized, one person at the top. There's other possibilities for these large, extended families that encompass those who are genetically related to each other and those who are connected by other means, sometimes by adoption too, by the way. Like, for example, my family on my mother's side, my adoptive mother, I would essentially describe it as a clan structure. It's this vast amount of originally French Canadians who, until my mother's generation, actually spoke French at home. She grew up speaking French before English. And this is after, they'd been in the States for 4 generations, because they would live in areas where you could do this. And everybody knew everybody. Cousins, were about as close as brothers and sisters in most people's nuclear families. You'd have this bevy of aunts and uncles who would make decisions essentially collaboratively. But the older, in that way, they were almost like a Roman Senate. The senectus, the people who were older, they would make the important decisions, and then the younger branch, would follow, and then the power would sort of flow downstairs. It's less like that these days, of course, because we've become much more Americanized. But since the advent of Facebook, I would say we're actually more like that now, because we're all on each other's Facebook. So it means we're all in each other's business a lot of the time, and that distance factor has been overcome. But we also do things like have a family reunion for 3 days every year. We've been doing that for close to 40 years now. And so, that's very different than, say, the Roman Familia, because there isn't just one person in charge. There was 5 or 6 people who had a say, who had a stake. That's more like a political thing for the Romans. And they didn't always agree with each other,
Oh yeah, for sure. But there was always a direction, because again, there still was a head of the family, and part of the responsibilities in there would have been the representation of the familia and in religious life and political life, the social sphere, and there are certain powers that were imbued with it. And obviously, all ownership ultimately would have kind of deferred back to the head of the family, and succession was important as well, how that played itself out. So in those, at least those qualities, beyond the just closeness of familiarity with blood relatives, there was still, yeah, exactly like you're describing, a clan. It was a unit that went kind of in the same direction, under the guidance of a very small group of people, ultimately vesting authority in one. So that's the kind of family that I always look at when I associate a Roman family, a classical family, and the origins of family.
Yeah, and that carries through beyond the fall of the Roman Empire too. You see a lot of things like that outside of Rome as well. I mean, the Persians were great rivals to the Romans, but the Persians, I would say, had something kind of similar, um, where you'll have, like you said, somebody on top who's the ultimate arbiter, the ultimate person who calls the shots, but who's also ultimately responsible too, when it comes to outside entities like, say, the state. Then this vast group of people, some of whom are related by blood, some of whom are adopted in, some of whom are just, they hang around and they eat at the table and they're involved. I mean, we see that going on through medieval Europe, in significant part because Roman institutions lasted beyond the fall of the Roman Empire and provided a way of making sense of things. I would say you see it going on, depending on where you're talking about, all the way into the 19th century and sometimes even the 20th century, depending on what country, France, for example, the notion of gender equality is something pretty recent in France compared to, say, in America. And the legal recognition of say women's right to vote or something like that is very, very recent in there. And if you look at, like, you read 19th century novels, well, it may have been a small little atomized family like you're talking about, like the nuclear family, but the father of the family is the person in charge. Now, I mean, in practice, it may work out very differently. There are a lot of families where there's a matriarchal figure, but usually when that happens, that matriarchal figure has to display something like what you've been talking about as traditional virtus, being able to deal with outside threats and being able to maintain, sort of structure and organization within the family. Think about, for example, there's quite a few in the American South. There's quite a few essentially matriarchal families, and it's not all the women who are calling the shots. It's one, usually the oldest one in the family, and then there'll be like other people lower down and lower down. When that sort of thing happens, she's not going to be just all light and sunshine and nicey nice all the time. She's going to actually be pretty tough. And so I suppose another way of thinking about that virtus is the category of toughness, of being able to endure, being able to exercise agency within the family, outside of the family, is absolutely essential. And it makes good sense, because if you don't have that, how are you going to keep a complex structure like the family together?
Well, you wouldn't. You'd be killed off fairly quickly.
Yeah. Or you get assimilated, like maybe the families that are more cohesive just sort of, pull off parts of the other families, they sort of suck them in, and then the other families, disappear.
What do you think? Okay, so one of the powers imbued at the paterfamilias in the Roman family was, and I'm probably going to butcher this because I don't speak Latin, is vita nec potestas, the power of life and death.
Yeah, I have to say that that existed, and you still see people trying to assert some stuff like that I have mixed feelings about that because it can lend itself to incredible abuse. Hopefully, the paterfamilias is a decent person, right, and is not going to abuse that, particularly like if they lose face in front of some other paterfamilias. But yeah, that was literally you could put your kids to death. You there It wasn't quite so cut and dry when it came to clients. There were a whole complex of relations with them, certain rights and obligations. So you might actually have a lot more control over your kids than you do over these other people sitting around your table and eating your food. Servants, things were pretty. I mean, they were property, so they could be disposed of the way that you saw fit. Hopefully, that didn't happen all that often, but
Let me throw out a few ideas because I somewhat disagree with the standard conception of how the power of life and death played itself out. There's there's a research paper I was reading not too long ago that kind of put me on a path that I didn't really expect to get out of it. So the power of life and death, as it was explained in this argument, is not a power. It's two powers. It's really the power to bring someone from a state of alive to dead, and one to bring from a state from dead to alive. Now, when you think about how could that possibly make sense, it's because they're referring to legal death. When you have laws in like a Hammurabi or some of the Roman laws, you're going to have statements like, if you are caught stealing in the night, you'll be sentenced to death, and then you shall not live. And if you're caught doing this or that, you're sentenced to death, you shall not live. But there's that you shall not live aspect to it that seems to be redundant. Now, part of the argument is that ultimately, when you're convicted of committing some crime that carries a death sentence, the paterfamilia carries that power to override that if the law allows for it. So there's certain crimes that carry the death sentence, but if the law does not necessarily state you shall not live, meaning that you will also be executed, not only are you legally dead, but you're going to be physically dead, the paterfamilia has the ability to decide whether that person's going to be executed or not.
So then the person could perhaps continue on, but only within the scope of the family, not out in public life.
No, they would be legally brought back to life, and a new punishment a lesser punishment would be issued for that particular crime. What the argument was trying to get at is that it wasn't so all-encompassing, the ability to now the thing about paterfamilias putting family members to death, that did obviously happen because the power of execution also Roman law allowed in certain contexts. Not only are they guilty, therefore they're legally dead, but as long as you're there, you might as well slit their throat, right? Because you have that ability and you won't be prosecuted for it.
And the paterfamilias was, in a certain sense, charged with maintaining Roman law within the household itself, which makes sense since there's not a lot of legal enforcement regime. There's not like a police force to do that sort of thing.
If you read, I don't know if you've ever gone through the 12 tablets, that basis for Roman law, right? They're short, they're fairly short, but if you read them, you get context clues too, in the sense that there was a lot of delegation of the legal authority to the individual to pursue their own, I guess, case, in the sense that if the court decided that someone was supposed to appear in court that you have brought a charge against, then they tell you to go get them and bring them. Go tie them up, go find them, tie them up, and bring them here. I mean, that would never happen today, right? Everything has to be handled through an intermediary.
Yeah, it does happen in like essentially fantasies, like our movies, right? But yeah, just imagine what chaos we would descend into if that was the case. I shouldn't be laughing about it because it'd be pretty horrific. But
well, it's the concept of citizen's arrest, right? But But there's that level of engagement. I think what I got out of the 12 tablets is that level of participation in the legal process that doesn't exist in our society now, where you weren't just kind of legally obligated to do certain things, but if things were done against you, you were kind of delegated to actually go sort it out yourself.
Yeah.
You know, the court's not going to waste its time sending a centurion or anything like that. You go do it. You figure it out. And also, that delegation was all in the laws extended to the ability to execute people, to
Yeah.
the sense that
I,
if the
su-
law, yeah,
I suppose we have a bit of an analogy to that in how people either press or don't press charges. You know, somebody does something against me, like they break into my place and they steal things. It's the police who do the investigation, who perhaps say arrest the person and interrogate them, and then the prosecutor. I mean, in a lot of cases, the prosecutor can decide to press the charges regardless of what the victim says. But in a lot of cases, it's up to the victim, either whether they're going to press the charges or whether they're going to appear in court and testify. And if they're unwilling to do that, you see a lot of police and prosecutors like, hey, then that's on you, buddy. You know, if you're not willing to actually stand up for yourself, then maybe we're not going to invest the time and resources, which are limited, that we have into pursuing this matter. I think that might be an analogy that's
yeah, that sounds fairly similar. And another, I guess, argument I would suppose would stand against the traditional interpretation of the power of life and death as just the ability to willy-nilly execute people is that many Roman slaves were actually citizens that just had a debt to pay off. So
yeah.
why would they ever do that if they knew who they were selling themselves to could just kill them at whim?
Well, that would be a special case, though. I mean, I don't think most of the slaves were citizens. Um, but you know, there's another interesting analogy. So in the the Old Testament laws that you find in, say, Leviticus and Numbers and Deuteronomy, and also to a lesser extent Exodus and Genesis. There's things in there like if your son does this, then kill him, and people who are arguing against religion, and also sometimes hard right religious people sometimes think that these laws were applied rigorously, and clearly they weren't, because the population in Judea and Israel would have been a hell of a lot smaller had they been, and so a lot of these laws were probably not enacted very often. Even the ones about adultery. I mean, I think it's nonsense to think that every single person who is caught in adultery was killed for it back in Old Testament times. Quite a few probably were, more than, say, those who said something bad to their parents or were disobedient, but certainly not all of them. And I think it's similar. When we think about the pater familias and this power of life and death, yes, technically, if your son mouths off to you, you could kill him, right? So you could say, look, don't mouth off to me, because if you do, power of life and death, buddy, and you're not going to like the outcome. But how many parents do we think actually did that sort of thing? I mean, some probably did out of cruelty. Hopefully there weren't that many. So that sort of thing still continues on today in horrific cases of child abuse that you read about. We don't have to contemporary stuff. Dostoevsky lists off a number of those, and Brothers Karamazov as well. So this is kind of a human constant, the capacity for cruelty, which is in a way going way beyond what the law allows. But on the other hand, there's a lot of leniency, I imagine, as well. The fact that go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say, specifically in relation to adultery. Now, there's a few laws that I found on the books that I'm not quite sure if they were Roman laws, but they're definitely Near East laws applied in that same general area. And the law specifically stated that if you catch, say, your wife with another man in bed, you can kill them both, but you can't just kill one.
Oh. Yeah,
So it's
I'm not familiar with that one. That's
yeah. So they either
what's
both go free, or you have to kill them both.
is there any like gloss or legal reasoning that's given with that?
I think it's because you can't selectively apply the judgment upon one being more guilty than another or something like that. I think that was kind of like if anything, that would have been a law protecting men, because odds are good that if anybody was to be killed, it would probably be the guy.
Yeah, I mean, you see this in Roman law that if you caught somebody in adultery, you got to do all sorts of things to them. The Greeks even had you know, you could sodomize them with a radish essentially, which is kind of a weird thing, but um, it was essentially to sort of reinforce. I mean, you could say reinforce the integrity of the household, or the authority of the person in charge of the household. Um, it's interesting because adultery, so going back to like ancient philosophy, right? Adultery gets viewed as particularly bad in a way that I think it's lost some of its sense in our own time that it had in ancient times. It was viewed as an offense, not only against the person who's been cheated on, but an offense to society, in part because illegitimate children may result from it. You can't be sure about lineage, so there's all that stuff. But it was also, there was a quasi-religious connection to it, not just in Judaism, but throughout ancient societies. That you're upsetting something fundamental in engaging in adultery. So it's a wider thing than just between the two spouses.
Well, I'm sure there's something that could be looked up in that. I mean, some of the obvious places to point to are the things you've just mentioned, upsetting the lineage, and so who knows what else. But
Yeah.
again, coming back down to this family and the paterfamilias and the power of life and death here. That kind of was the general structure, the level of authority you would have in a family, the kind of clan-like setup that is quite enormous and quite different from the nuclear family. Now, here's a question I'd like to hear your take on. Now, you have a contingent of people that are observing the collapse of the nuclear family, and they want to, I guess, recapture the legal conditions and the cultural conditions under which that would kind of become the norm again, and that becoming a cohesive unit. Now, when you contrast that the nuclear family is a consequent further down the line from the family structure in Roman times, which one ought a traditionalist appeal to, considering that one is more traditional to another? And if you looked at a nuclear family from the context of a paterfamilias, the nuclear family is a breakdown of the family.
Yeah, so there's a lot to say about this in response. Let me start by saying I think one reason why it might be more attractive to some people who want to be traditionalists in that respect, and want a family, why they might prefer the nuclear family, is because if you imagine, let's say we imagine sort of in a Rawlsian way, with the veil of ignorance, a society in which we suddenly restructure everything in accordance with this, traditional family ruled by a paterfamilias. And let's just say we even take gender out of it. It could be a materfamilias too. So, it might be more attractive. And then we have, as an alternative, a whole bunch of nuclear families, right? Now, a person might look at that and say, well, if I end up being the pater or materfamilias, things are going to be pretty good for me in this arrangement. But what if I end up happening to be one of the servants or the clients or some aunt who's off in the corner who does whatever she does but will never share in power, right? There's less slots available for getting to exercise agency and control over your own life and all this other sort of stuff, right? So I think that that may be, and I don't think that they're actually like sitting down and doing this, like I said, Rawlsian veil of ignorance thought example. But I think on a sort of implicit level, that may be part of what's going on. People like the idea of, hey, this is my house. I get to decide, not, Uncle so-and-so who happens to be in charge of the family. So I think there's some of that. And there's also, among people who want to call themselves traditional or traditionalists, there's also been, this media saturation of dramas and scripts where it is the nuclear family from the 1950s on, right? It's interesting too, because this criticism of the breakdown of family structure doesn't just come from the right; it also comes from the left. You see Adorno and Horkheimer, for example, in the 1930s, talking about what industrialization and modern capitalism has done to even the nuclear family, and sort of just permeated it with market relations. And so the nuclear family isn't even what it used to be, but that's not, something else. So there's all that to be said. The other thing that I would say too is I don't know that it is necessarily a choice between either the Roman family or 1950s nuclear family, because you do have things like my own family structure where there's kind of a shared collaborative power that's running the show on top, which is a bit more flexible and robust because pater familias dies. Now you got to have a succession issue. If you've got 12 uncles and aunts calling the shots, or great uncles and aunts, and they actually can function well together, if one of them dies, things just keep on going on smoothly, But what should we have as the traditional thing? I mean, you're right that the traditional family is more complex. It's not as if there weren't individual households at the time that look more like the contemporary nuclear family, But those are mostly poor people, right? If you had any wealth, you probably had some servants, and actually, it was, in a way, it was a good thing, because we usually look at the servant to household relation as a bad thing. Power is being exercised and all that, but it actually meant that a lot of people could be fed who otherwise might have been totally on their own and screwed.
Well, I want to piggyback off a few points that you brought up. One of them is that this comparison between the nuclear family and the Roman family, doing the Rawlsian thought experiment. Now, I doubt anybody's doing that. Not only because they wouldn't necessarily know what Rawls, who Rawls is, and what.
Yeah, traditionalists and Rawls don't usually go along with each other.
No. And in addition to this, I don't think they're really thinking of the Roman family at all. In fact,
Yeah.
I doubt that people conceive of it in that fashion. But the argument they do put forward, which I think is interesting, and I think it's an argument somewhat out of ignorance, is that the nuclear family is the building block of society, right?
Oh, yeah.
Right. But clearly that can't be the case because it was preceded by something much grander. So in that argument structure, I've always looked at it that if indeed the family is the building block of society, which it can be, because if you think about clans, right? How are you going to get a bunch of clans to cooperate with each other? You're going to have to come up with some sort of common rule set, but at the same time, no clan leader would just give up their authority. So you need a somewhat of a contained compromise where you create like a coalition of some sort between clans, between these families. So to me, the nuclear family is this kind of degeneration of the traditional family. But the statement by these traditionalists is that the nuclear family, this degenerate version of the Roman setup, or that old setup, is the building block. So it's interesting how they would bridge that gap.
Yeah, and sometimes they'll make appeals to older, social theories, like say Aristotle, right? And in the Politics, he says, well, you have the first community is the family, but by that he's talking about the oikos, which is a household, which can be as just male, female, and an ox. or one servant, but usually is something larger, more like the Potter, like the traditional Roman family. I think when they're reading that, they automatically read in nuclear family, and they just sort of assume that sort of structure to it. Another thing to point out too is when nuclear families in our time are particularly successful, they often start to branch out and build something more like the paterfamilias, right? Except instead of having servants, things are outsourced. So you have a nanny who does this thing, and you pay her instead of her being in an indentured servant relation or whatever you want. And you have your professionals who like do your taxes and all that sort of stuff. But it draws in this structure. So for when I was a kid, I went to a private middle school. It was very eye-opening because at that time, my father was still alive, and he was making decent money, although not a ton of it because he was a tax attorney. And so I got to go to school with these kids who were very rich. And I'll also say this, there were the kids who were smart and the kids who were rich, and there wasn't a lot of overlap in that school between the two. I was there on scholarship, and so were a few of my friends. And I got to see, by participating in some of their family affairs and also seeing how things went, where my dad would have like a rich client who would say, take us on a yacht, or there'd be a Christmas thing. You get to look around and see something like that traditional structure with clients, right? Being part of a household, not in exactly the same sense. It wasn't a permanent relationship, but they had a social standing that was very different than that of the other nuclear families, living in their bungalows or ranch-style homes or whatever. So I think that there is still something analogous to that going on, but we gloss between the two of these because we think, well, there's really no difference between a mom and pop and a couple kids living in a 3-bedroom ranch, and maybe they've got their own business, a small business, or they both work for a living. And between this family over here, that's essentially a dynasty, well-connected, living in a mansion, participating in social life, naming buildings after themselves. Well, they're just families, right? So they're all really on the same level, and that's nonsense. So that's one thing to say in response.
Oh,
to
for
that.
sure, exactly, and that is nonsense to conflate the sort of dynastic family like you're describing with just a nuclear family where with 4 or 5 members, if there's any kids at all. An analogy that I've been working towards when thinking about this concept is I looked at the powers and the responsibilities of the paterfamilias, the extensiveness of it, and the kind of the role and the direction of a family as it would have been presented then. And I look at a corporation as pretty much manifests the same thing.
Yeah.
So,
except, that's really interesting because we could say that there's the older style corporation where there was this language of family, and there was there was a lot of exploitation going on, but there isn't a traditional family too, right? So, and there's imbalances in power and all that, but there was still like, well, look, you look out for us, and we're going to look out for you, and I'm on top, I'm in charge. So if you don't like the way things are going, maybe shut the hell up and let me run the show, right? And that's very much like that. The modern corporations, and by this I don't mean like 1950s. I'm thinking like contemporary corporations. A lot of them aren't like that. They use the language of, well, we're all one big family, or we're all one big team, but they're willing to cut you loose like that. Many of them, and there's a lot more in and out happening. I think part of that is just the dynamics of the marketplace. Things are as a capitalist theory would predict, they get much tighter as far as what profit margins can be. Everybody has to be much more efficient, and in some ways, the modern corporation is less like a family. Here's one thing that you can say about a family. We often say, well, you can pick your friends, but you can't pick your family, which means, in a certain respect, well, you got to put up with a lot of nonsense that you wouldn't put up with other people from your family members, right? They're not always the brightest or the best put together, and they may say the same things about you. I mean, my family could say plenty of things like that about me because I've made a lot of dumb mistakes over my life, and said a lot of dumb things, and they still are connected with you. And the old corporation tended to be like that. Unless you really managed to screw things up, you wouldn't get fired, right? But the modern corporation isn't like that at all, you know.
It's hard to say though, because you're looking at some of the loyalty binds that usually you can find in family. But even look at
Yeah,
the loyalty that you see in families even today. That's shaky. That is also very shaky. Parents are willing to kick their kids out at 18 if they don't, behave themselves. The children are disowning their parents. They're not looking after them in older health. A lot of that is collapsing even in that mutual relationship. I think a corporation, that analogy still carries through. I think it's just all reflected all throughout society. In fact, when you look at companies like Google, for example, many of the software houses out there, you see these stereotypes, especially from the early 2000s. You see Google being this well, not Google then, but like Microsoft, later on Google,
yeah,
providing all this food, all these amenities that you could basically live on their campus and have everything taken care of. Well, that's extending. As these sorts of companies are becoming a little bit more women dominated, you have a lot more interest being put into things like childcare. So you have on-site daycare facilities in some of these places. What I'm
yeah,
starting to see is that the corporation is starting to kind of accommodate the setup of a family, but on the emotional side, other things are forming. Especially in IT companies, you have a lot of that zeal, and this was happening in the 80s for, say, companies like Apple with these kind of cult-like personalities with Steve Jobs, right? Where he would pit
yeah,
one team against the other, go to war with each other, the Lisa team versus the Macintosh team, or whatever it was that they had going on. But people that are creating these strong emotional attachments to their identities, especially there was an ex-employee of Facebook that wrote a book. I don't remember the name of either the book or him. I remember listening to a short interview about half an hour that he was describing it. He was saying that there was about a month or two when Google Plus was released by Google, and Zuckerberg
yeah.
saw this as an existential threat to Facebook. So he
I remember.
internally,
Yeah, yeah,
yeah, he declared war on Google, internally specifically rallied the troops, incredible overtime. Every department was involved. They had some master strategy how they're going to put Google Plus out of business. But this guy that wrote this book was commenting on how incredibly fanatical this was. And he tried to contextualize if this was happening in Google's side. So he'd go over to the Google parking lot on a weekend. There's nobody there. They don't care. Right? But in Facebook, it's like it's a war being fought from one direction, and the other person doesn't know they're involved. Um,
yeah.
but
And
that's
by the
all.
company that seems, at least in that respect, the social media respect, to have more resources. You know.
Yeah, but they're so committed emotionally, and you don't really see that happening when someone has their own family and priorities that are beyond the job being just a source of income. And what it feels like to me is with these feels, and also empirically could be seen in many ways, even from my own personal experience in the IT field, is that there is ever closer bonds being formed emotionally and also in pragmatic ways with the corporation. You're becoming more of a company man in the sense of kind of uh, uh, everything is done by your company. If you chose to, you could really never go off the Google campus and you'd be just fine because they have housing, they have
Yeah,
food, they have facilities, they have everything. All your friends could be Google people, and also animosities form, like through the description of this ex-Facebook employee, that it's irrational to hate Google because they released a product. There's
yeah,
nothing binding you to Facebook where you're so attached, unless you did perceive it in a way like it's your family, like it's your tribe, it's your clan. And those sort of relationships, I think, are becoming more common, and potentially they may become much more common if indeed the nuclear family, which was an anchor for many of these feelings, disappears all completely, and people will search for identity somewhere.
yeah. So I think there are, like you're talking about, perhaps the tech field is one where this happens the most. It used to be like that in like universities as well. Everything would happen within that. Now, though, a lot of things are sort of just outsourced, and it doesn't happen in that way. And I think in other fields, um, things that the company would have been handling wind up getting handled by other companies, and you don't have that direct connection. So there's sort of, the tech fields are going this way. A lot of the other corporations are going in a different direction. So yeah, and it's interesting too with like Apple. You think about, they manage not only to do that for their employee base, they also manage to get their customer base to be rather fanatical about what they do. You know,
Yeah.
although that's wearing off, and you see. So I have a lot of, let's call them Apple file friends. I'm an Apple user. I have like right now this is on an iMac and I have an iPhone, but I'm what you would call a pragmatic Apple user. I don't care. I used PCs for a long time. Just so long as the system works, just don't bother me with the details, right? So I can focus on what I need to focus on. And if we weren't already locked into a plan, I would be fine going to Android. I have no investment in that. And I actually found all the sort of worship of Steve Jobs myself rather distasteful. I'm not big on that sort of thing. But what I can recognize is Steve Jobs was an incredibly charismatic figure, and all these Apple users, they were doing something in terms of their imagination and a shared experience, and Apple, being different and being better and all that stuff for a long time. Now, since Jobs is gone, Apple has been doing a lot of dumb things. They've made a lot of mistakes here and there. Like just most recent upgrade for this, the phone runs much more slowly now with key functions like the map, where you need that to be on spot and able to be used immediately if you're driving, right? And there's no charismatic head anymore running things. It's turned into a regular corporation, which is what it was the whole time. I mean, but they had Jobs out there. And you hear people, when you complain about this sort of stuff, saying, that would have never happened in Steve Jobs' time. As if
Exactly.
It's that logic of, if only the great leader knew what was going on. And this is if only the king was aware of the abuses that his ministers are engaging in, this 18th century France, right? If only the president, the CEO knew what these middle managers are doing, he would straighten it out right away. No, who knows what they would do? They're a blank cipher to us. We have no idea what they would do. But you see that Apple was able to do that in a way that Microsoft never was able to do that. People use Microsoft, but I don't think they have a great affection for Microsoft as a company. And Microsoft is a great company. They've done a lot of really cool stuff. The products mostly work,
There's a culty component to it. There is, and they're all the same in trying to peddle at least some of that sort of cultiness. I mean, look at this one. And the clear statement of this is one role that exists in all these companies is the role of an evangelist. Right?
Oh yeah.
So Microsoft have evangelists. Google, I'm pretty sure they do as well, and I know Facebook do as well. So they all have evangelist roles, and the role of an evangelist is fundamentally to turn people to your technology, not necessarily through argumentation about features or anything of that nature, but whatever kind of mechanism that you can just go out and praise its glory and the greatness of what you can do with it. So it's interesting. It's a form of marketing, I suppose, a form of advertising, but it does have that culty feeling to it.
Well, when you're successful with that, you turn your user base, your customers, into a sort of replicator base. They start doing the evangelization for you. They start having conversations with people who aren't yet converted, about the good news of Apple. Or Microsoft,
That's hilarious. The good news, yes.
Yeah. Well, that, and that's good marketing too. I mean, that's one of the things because I have a business, I end up reading, things like Fast Company or Inc. and all that. And every once in a while, you'll see an interesting article about, how do you get your user base to be doing the marketing for you, right? And I've never been particularly successful in doing that, but I also haven't put much thought into it because I'm still not sure how I feel about that, right? But these companies, that's how they've been so successful, I think, and other companies have done that. When Ford was making great cars, people would be out there talking about what great cars they were. It's been a long time since that was the case, but a lot of successful businesses do that. I'm not sure how that connects us back to like the traditional family. We've ranged a bit away from that.
Right.
Let's see if I can think of some connection.
Well, no, I think it started when I mentioned up the alternative analogy of the corporation as a continuation of or continuation as an almost a return to the Roman style family. So yeah, I mean, there's a lot that could be said about that. I can definitely say that I've witnessed behavior that would put people as looking at the company that they work for, especially younger people, as strongly identifying with it in ways that I think aren't really healthy, in ways that I think that if you did have a much stronger family ties and connections, you would never invest yourself as much into, I guess, the vision of the company or whatever you want to call it. But we'll see what happens. Now, there's one more question I'd like to go through maybe before we finish up,
Sure.
because we've been going for a little while. Is that recently, I guess, it's not really a formulated argument as much as a hint at an argument being put forward in the MGTOW community is whether or not modernity is compatible with reality. And this is grounded on the premise that the birth rates are substantially falling under modernity. And modernity is kind of defined. So I guess there's a lot of wiggle room to exploring that subject. But the general thesis is modernity actually capable of retaining humanity into the future? Or need there be a return to something more traditional, whether or not it's the nuclear family or something earlier than that?
Wow, that's a huge question. So let me spin it off in two different ways. One would be like the birth rate issue. I mean, in some ways, it's good that as we modernize, birth rates drop off because we can't keep indefinitely increasing the human population. We're getting pretty close to what may be our highest capacity. I'm not for antinatalism or any of that sort of stuff myself, but I do think that if our population growth starts to taper off, that's a good thing in many respects as far as consumption of resources. Where a lot of the problem comes in is we're unfortunately tied in economically to this structure where we need continual growth, right? Because we have to provide people with cheap consumer commodities, or else they go crazy and riot and destroy things, and that's rough on the economy as well. It creates a lot of uncertainty and destroys material goods. But sooner or later, we're probably going to have to deal with the fact that we are going to have this drop off in young workers, and we can't get over it just by importing them, as the West is trying to do, from other places where the population rate hasn't, the growth rate hasn't dropped off quite so much, right? Sooner or later, everybody's going to be having less kids. And how are we going to refigure or restructure the economy so that this doesn't lead to all the old people living terrible lives, or all the young people saying, wow, there's a huge undue burden on us, screw all the old people, let's kill them all off, or any of these other nightmare scenarios. So there's that, right? And I don't really have an answer to that other than saying, well, we're going to have to really rethink quite a few things, and I'm not sure we have the political capacities to do that. So we might see like revolutions.
Logan's Run. That's where we're headed to. Logan's Run.
We watched that just earlier this summer, in part because I had I'd seen it as a kid, and I was telling my wife and kids about it. I was like, we gotta check this out, and it's not bad. A lot of those 70s sci-fi movies really did not stand the test of time, but that one was pretty decent. So there's all of that stuff. With respect to the MGTOW community, they're in kind of a strange place, right? Because if they're pursuing the MGTOW sort of, you might call it lifestyle or commitment or philosophy as a way of life, then although they may belong as a child to a family, they're not creating families, right? So in a certain sense, it doesn't matter that much what the other people out there, what family structure they have, because the MGTOW people aren't going to be involved in it, right?
Well, it's kind of a half mixed truth in there. It is true that MGTOW, for the most part, would not engage in anything resembling a traditional family, but there is nothing. There's nothing in the community that suggests that people aren't interested in children, meaning that alternative technologies as well as methods are being explored by many members, surrogacy and the artificial womb and anything of that nature. Right now, surrogacy is clearly the only possible option. So the hindrance in the formation of the traditional family under MGTOW is ultimately not just the legal condition of laws, the divorce laws specifically, but also the rejection of the male provider role to pander to the leisure class, right? Meaning women, housewives. That's a huge rejection of it. And because that is expected in a traditional family, that setup won't work. And because even if a woman works, the laws don't tailor to that arrangement won't work either. So there is no combination under which a MGTOW would see themselves pairing off with a woman for a long-term setup. But children, that's a different story. And I think it's quite possible that there will be exemplars in some part in the future, considering that MGTOW it's bridging on, going on to it's approaching a decade at this point. At least a lot of the YouTube stuff is approaching a decade in terms of activity, maybe 6 or 7 years at this point. So it's still relatively new. So to actually experience how people play it out in the long term, especially the younger individuals who still have that option ahead of them, as opposed to some of the older men that may already have children or are just not interested because they never were. So I think over the next 2 decades, we'll see how it plays itself out.
One of the things who's a committed MGTOW could fit into the traditional, very hierarchical, large family structure might be precisely in being in one of those roles, not necessarily as the paterfamilias, but one of those other roles, not way at the bottom, but something almost like a Roman client, right? Where they're not part of the marriage structure, but they do something within that organization, and they find some meaning being there, without having to be married or in a relationship or something like that. I don't know. That bears a lot more thinking. I mean, first of all, you got to find a family like that, right? they're not always that hard. They're not always that easy to come by or to get into. But that seems like it would be an option. I suppose there could be a lot of different ways in which people who are committed to the MGTOW lifestyle could live it out. There might be things down the line, sort of like semi-monastic communities, or intentional communities of other sorts, where, like, we talked about the importance of friendship and the meaning that provides in life, and it's easier to do that when you can actually spend time with your friends, if you're living in the same place.
Yeah, I mean, again, there's no clear structure, and I don't think anyone's trying to work towards one or another. There's definitely there's no discourse revolving around formations of exclusionary communities. Not really. I mean, from time to time, these things pop up, but
Yeah.
I don't think anybody's actively working on anything like that. It's not really a disassociation from society too much that I can observe happening. I think there's ambitions in some of the members for possibly political reasons or other reasons that are not strictly MGTOW centered, that do encourage people to go off the grid and things like that. But within MGTOW
Hmm.
itself, I think a lot of it is just a disengagement from many of the expectations, um, not just from society, but even from their own urges, a kind of a distancing
Yeah.
from some of these things as well.
You could look at it as sort of a grand experiment, with one's own life. What would be what sort of like what's the worst that would happen, and then what opportunities would that open up if I, instead of like, a lot of people get, they're in a relationship, the relationship breaks up, then they're on the rebound looking for another relationship. If instead of doing that, I just go my own way. Um, what would I encounter that I don't like? How bad would that actually be? And then what opportunities would that open up, and what obstacles would need to be overcome, in order to have a more intentional, more autonomous life. That's part of what I'm fascinated with. I'm not in MGTOW. I'm married, and you know have kids by a previous marriage and all that sort of stuff. But I'm fascinated to see what you guys make of it.
You're Dr. Sadler, you're part of the statistics we warn against, my friend.
Yeah.
um, but then again, I think there's a lot of people carrying all sorts of stories into it. And it's interesting because even trauma doesn't really set off some men to go down the MGTOW route. I think there's a quality about these men that they brought into MGTOW that kind of makes MGTOW very natural towards them. It may very well be that this is something that's always existed in a very hushed up fashion, which it probably has. But now what's ended up happening is that the internet has brought all these people into one space, and the laws are just encouraging people to enter this community or making them more aware of this community. You'll have a contingent of these men that are MGTOW for a year up until they recover or find a girlfriend. They just leave. It's kind of these tourists. But yeah, they're
Yeah.
MGTOW to the extent that they need it, but then they get a girlfriend. It's like, fuck you, I'm getting laid.
Yeah, I suppose it's sort of like, for them, it's a way to get themselves back on their feet emotionally, right?
Yeah, yeah.
And insofar as it does that, I suppose that's a good thing. For helping people, the goal is helping people work through their trauma or their pain, their
Well, it's a male-only space, and
mistaken assumptions.
yeah, it's probably one
Go
of the
ahead.
only male-only spaces that are definitionally incapable of being infiltrated, because it's just the ideas are just so incoherent with letting women into it that it doesn't make logical sense for that ever to happen. But
Yeah,
yeah,
I can tell you. I can tell you that you guys get a lot of bad press from women's sites, but it doesn't
oh,
seem to be much of it. Seems to be, and I'm just only going by
yeah,
a
yeah,
few
yeah.
MGTOW people that I know. Much of what they have to say seems to be rather disconnected from what you guys actually represent.
There's obviously a narrative and an impression that's being painted of MGTOW. And again, in the community itself, there's a lot you can cherry pick from to paint nearly any picture that you want. I think
Yeah.
we just need to spend time and see who's kind of relevant in terms of being listened to, that has a substantial audience, see what they're saying, and to see what they're saying over a long period of time as well. What you'll find is that some of the guys that have been around for years, they've gone through some of the more problematic in the sense of, for the media, problematic statements that you might encounter on, like, whatever, Jezebel or whoever else might be talking about
Yeah.
it. You can mine that from pretty much every single MGTOW, simply because there's always that red pill rage that you kind of enter with, and then it goes away, and then you move on to other things. I mean, the subject matter that we explore in MGTOW videos is so broad that it's sometimes hard to identify what constitutes a MGTOW video, other than I think all of them are ultimately centered around identity in one form or another, either self-improvement or education or something that delves around that angle. Like you wouldn't see a MGTOW video on botany, for example. Well, not really, unless it's geared in the context of going off the grid in some pragmatic fashion, or on geology, right? Like that sort of thing wouldn't really make any sense. Going for almost an hour and a half now, and I think we should wrap it up for the moment. So Dr. Sadler, thank you for taking the time. We've definitely covered a lot of ground, and it's been quite interesting. I look forward to potentially, if you'll come on again, that we have another talk about some other subjects. And
absolutely.
And for everyone listening, there's going to be links in the descriptions to Dr. Sadler's website, his YouTube channel, and please do check it out. It's a great channel. I get a lot of my philosophical stuff on from there as well, especially on philosophers I don't really actively read. So do that. And I guess for now, thanks everybody, and thank you, Dr. Sadler.
Well, thanks for having me on again.
Cheers. Bye-bye.
All right. Bye.